We're delighted that topics like this will again make the front page of the newspaper. And I know you've all heard by now that apparently the sniper or snipers have been arrested, which is a tremendous relief to people in this area, especially in the Washington area, most particularly, but even around the nation. So all of us are so pleased and relieved, of course, and it does allow us to focus upon a variety of other things and allow the media to focus on other things. We're delighted that Mr. Bradtke is with us. He's had a wonderful career in the State Department. He's twice gotten their Superior Honor Award, which is a great distinction. He entered the Foreign Service in 1973 after having received his education at Notre Dame, did graduate work at, again, SAIS Bologna, and at the University of Virginia. He had early postings in Guyana and Yugoslavia. He had the great honor, well, he's in the European Office of Eastern European Affairs, but he had the honor of being an American Political Science Association Congressional Fellow, and he remarked that while working for Senator Mathias, which was one of his 2 assignments, along with an assignment to Dick Cheney, he first saw this particular building. But that's a very honorific position. It may not have resulted, but later he was in the Bureau of Legislative Affairs, where he served as first Deputy Assistant Secretary and then later as Acting Secretary. He's been posted in Moscow and Bonn. Warren Christopher selected him to be his executive assistant. He later was Deputy Chief of Mission in London, and then was appointed by President Clinton to be the Executive Director of the National Security Council, position which he held until a little over a year ago when he took up his present post. So we have with us tonight a gentleman who's had some marvelous assignments and is certainly an authority on this extraordinarily interesting topic of NATO and our relations with Europe. It's my great pleasure to present to you Mr. Robert Bradtke.
Thank you very much, Frank, for that kind introduction. One of the things that Frank did not mention in that introduction is I'm a big baseball fan, and many of my trips to Baltimore have been to visit a site which is just a little south of here. It is also, as a baseball fan, that I'm particularly grateful to see all of you who have come to hear me this evening. If I would have had the same choice as you've had between watching Game 5 of the World Series tonight and listening to me speak, I'm not sure I would have made the same choice you've made. So I very much appreciate your coming. I also appreciate your coming because diplomats have not always enjoyed the best reputation. Many of you, I'm sure, recall the remarks that a diplomat is an honest person who's been sent abroad to lie for his country. That was actually one of the kinder things that have been said about diplomats. It was Dean Acheson, former Secretary of State, who certainly should have did know something about diplomacy, who said the first requirement of a statesman is that he be dull. Now that may be bad news for you who are going to be listening to me for the next hour, but I hope I can convince you that we are working in Washington on something that I think is truly exciting and historic, and that is the Prague Summit, which will take place a little less than a month from today, and the transformation of NATO. Now, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, has been, in my view, the most successful alliance in history. It was the way the West defended itself against the Soviet Union, and ultimately its solidarity and military strength were critical to defeating the Warsaw Pact in a peaceful fashion and bringing about the end of the Soviet Empire. NATO was also the shield. It was the way that the countries of Western Europe that had been so badly destroyed in World War II could rebuild their economies. It was also a shield behind which countries that had been enemies, like France and Germany, could bring about a reconciliation. After the end of the Cold War, NATO also took on the problem of ethnic conflict in Bosnia and Kosovo. And we still have, it's worth remembering, we still have more than 40,000 NATO troops in the Balkans, maintaining stability and peace there. So NATO has been a tremendous success in its history. And one of the reasons it's been a success is because NATO's leaders have had the courage and the wisdom to adapt the alliance to changing circumstances. They've adapted the alliance to new threats as these threats came along. And in my view, the alliance is on the verge of just such an historic transformation. Now, there are two key points that I would like to point to as points of departure in talking about NATO's transformation. The first is a speech that President Bush gave in Warsaw in June of last year. I was still working at the White House at that time, and I had the great honor and privilege of being in Warsaw with the president. He gave a speech at the Warsaw University Library, a new building which captures the best of modern architecture with a certain traditional style. And in that speech, the president laid out a vision for Europe, for the future of Europe. And it was a very ambitious vision for a Europe that was whole and stable and at peace. And it was also in that speech that he provided a bit of a challenge for our European partners. That challenge was to keep Europe's institutions, NATO and the European Union, open to all the democracies of Europe that were prepared to accept the responsibilities of being members of these organizations. He talked about these institutions being open to the countries from the Baltic to the Black Sea. And this speech probably didn't get as much attention in the United States as it should have, because it really did capture the imagination of everyone in the audience in Warsaw, but also the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, because the president was opening a door to them, to NATO membership, and to the membership in European institutions that was really very critical. It was also a challenge to our Western European partners, who had a much narrower vision of what NATO should be doing in the next round of taking in new members. So the president laid down this challenge. This challenge became even more complicated, important, after September 11. And that is the second kind of crucial event that I would like to bring into focus here. September 11 and the action we took in Afghanistan pointed to several different things relevant and important to NATO. First thing it pointed out was really the deficiencies of NATO. Now, you know that after September 11, the NATO countries came together in Brussels. They met. They decided to offer their assistance to us under what's called Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty. And that article says that an attack on one is an attack on all. This was the first time in the history of the alliance that this article had been used. But what we found after September 11, after the invocation of Article 5, was that NATO did not have many of the capabilities we needed to do what we had to do in Afghanistan. We found that NATO was still too prepared for a war that wasn't any more relevant. It was a war in Central Europe that NATO had prepared itself to fight. And NATO did not have the capabilities to take on this new kind of conflict. Some of the capabilities we were missing, for example, was mobility. And I remember Secretary Powell, in a meeting I was with, describing this to one of his European colleagues. He referred back to the time when he was a general in the American Army in Europe. And he said, in the time of the Soviet Union, we didn't worry so much about how to get our troops to the front. The front was going to come to us. All we had to do was get in our tanks and jeeps and drive to the front. Well, in this new threat that we face of terrorism, and this new challenges we face, we need the ability to move our troops beyond Europe's borders to deal with the threat wherever it comes from. A second deficiency that we saw in the alliance was a deficiency in precision-guided munitions. And this really has changed the face of warfare in the last decade. In the Gulf War, 3% of the bombs and ordnance that were used by our air forces were precision-guided munitions, these laser-targeted and other kinds of munitions that are very accurate. By the time we got to Kosovo, the figure was 30% of the weapons, the bombs, the ordnance that was dropped. By the time we got to Afghanistan, and in the campaign that the American Air Force carried out in Afghanistan, the figure went up to 60%. Well, only the United States and one or two allies have these kind of weapons, have these kind of capabilities. So again, as we looked around After September 11, for who could help us do what we had to do, we saw that NATO was missing another key capability. Finally, another capability that we realized NATO did not have the way the United States forces had was really the ability to manage communications and information. And that has become critical to the kind of conflict that we fought in Afghanistan. Secretary Rumsfeld is very fond of recounting a story that he was told by somebody in the Special Forces units that were fighting in Afghanistan. And this was a Special Forces officer who was with the Northern Alliance forces fighting against the Taliban. And he was with these Northern Alliance forces that were on horseback. And he had, this American, the ability to communicate via satellite communications with an aircraft that was flying overhead, which was in turn directing American aircraft to carry out strikes against the Taliban. So this also was a capability. As we looked around the alliance was missing. There were not enough of these kind of capabilities to manage secure information and communications. So that was the first set of things we focused on in the aftermath of September 11 when we looked at NATO and its deficiencies. The other thing that we perceived after September 11 was a change in the meaning, if you will, of becoming a member of the alliance and what kind of alliance it would be that new members would be joining and what they would be called upon to do. It was clear to us, clearer perhaps than it had been before September 11, that the new allies who would come into the alliance would not be fighting a tank war in Central Europe. We would need them and their help to fight against these new threats, and we would need a different kind of set of capabilities. We didn't need countries that had large land armies. We needed countries that were prepared to contribute to security in other ways. And one of the examples that we pointed to is, again, a way that NATO and what NATO needed was changing, was the Czech Republic. Now, NATO brought the Czech Republic into the alliance. We invited them in 1997. We brought them in at Madrid in 1999. And the Czech Republic does not have a big army. They don't have a lot of tanks. But what they had that we needed for Afghanistan was they had a very good unit that was capable of decontaminating and dealing with biological and chemical weapons. And when we went into Afghanistan, we didn't know what we were going to find. And it was very helpful to have this Czech unit deployed to the theater so that it could help if we ran into chemical or biological weapons. So, as I say, after September 11, we did a rethinking of the kinds of roles that new members would play and what kind of capabilities we were looking for in new members. The third thing that September 11 brought into focus was a different relationship with Russia. Russia, which had been the enemy of NATO, was no longer in that position. And the president tells, with a lot of emotion, how the first phone call he got after September 11 from a foreign leader was from President Putin. And President Putin offered to help, and he told the president that he was standing down all the Russian forces, so there could be no possibility there'd be any confusion about where this attack was coming from. And that had a great effect on the president. And the Russians have since then actually made good on the promise of help, and they have, without their help, we could not have carried out the campaign that we carried out in Afghanistan. The campaign in Afghanistan also brought home to us how the countries of Central Asia, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, took on a different importance. These countries were critical to the efforts we undertook in Afghanistan. They provided us overflight rights and basing rights. We could not have carried out the military efforts we did without their cooperation. So we looked at all of these new elements after September 11. The capabilities issue, the relationship with Russia, the qualities we wanted in new members. We looked at the president's speech, his vision for Warsaw, and we had a meeting in the White House Situation Room in the early fall. And I will say the White House Situation Room does not look like the White House Situation Room in West Wing. It's much grander in I love West Wing, but the Situation Room in West Wing is a much grander place. It's actually a rather small and cramped room. But we met in the Situation Room, and we discussed now, with the lessons of September 11 and the lessons and the vision of the president's speech, how we could put these two things together to work on the summit that NATO is scheduled to hold in November this year. And we, in thinking this through, came up with three themes, which are going to be the themes of the Prague Summit. The first is new capabilities. Second is new members. The third is new relationships. And what I'd like to do, I don't want to go on too long, I'd like to leave some time for discussion questions, is just talk briefly about each of these three elements and the progress we've made since that day, basically a year ago, when we met in the Situation Room and we decided that this should be the focus of the Prague Summit. First of all, new capabilities. One of the most important things that we have done is to propose, and Secretary Rumsfeld did this a couple of weeks ago when there was a meeting of NATO defense ministers, what we are calling the NATO Response Force. This is really a relatively radical idea for NATO. This would be a force drawn from all the countries of the alliance on a rotating basis that would have the capability to send up to 20,000 troops on a mission in a period and get itself organized as short a notice as 7 days. Now, we think this is a critical capability. It would fill that gap that we saw on September 11 in the aftermath of September 11. And we are very pleased that the response of our allies has been to welcome this effort. I say this is a radical thing for NATO, because NATO is always focused on Europe, on the possibility of a conflict in Europe. And we've had a great debate in NATO about out of area. That debate is over, and this force is an example now of how NATO has to be used, has to be prepared to defend its members against attack from anywhere in the world. We've also made great progress since last year on getting consensus within the NATO alliance on improving some of those capabilities that I mentioned: mobility, secure communications, biological and chemical weapons defense, precision-guided munitions. And we hope at Prague that the leaders of the alliance will make very specific commitments on how they're going to respond and how they're going to deal with this. Some of this is going to require more defense spending, and the United States is leading the way with a very large increase in the defense budget. We need our allies and partners to do the same. But there are other things that can be done that will not cost a lot of money. The Germans, for example, have just recently, within the last week, proposed an initiative involving the leasing of C-17 aircraft, which would be leased by a consortium of European countries. And this will enable Europe to address, our European allies, to address that deficit we have in air mobility. So this kind of pooling partnership is one way of dealing with it. Other allies are looking at what we call specialization, on the model of what I referred to before of the Czech Republic, of how the alliance had a need for a highly specialized capability like chemical and biological weapons defense. And they're looking at areas like special forces, weapons demolition, demining, things like that, capabilities that they can bring of a specialized nature to the alliance that we don't need everybody in the alliance to have. The third area in capabilities that we've made progress on is changing the command structure in NATO. When we looked at NATO after September 11, it wasn't just the forces in NATO that were not the right mixture, the right composition. It was also the command structure. We have two strategic commands in NATO. One, a land command, Supreme Allied Commander Europe, who's based in Europe, General Ralston. And we had a second command at Norfolk, whose responsibility was to counter what we were expecting to be the Soviet threat to shipping in the North Atlantic. Well, we realized that threat has gone away, that to have command structures set up at that level to deal with that threat was really not a good use of NATO's resources. So the United States has been leading this effort to revise NATO's command structure, to change the structure, to make it more relevant to the kind of new threats that we face. So we again have been working with our allies, and we hope that leaders at Prague will join us in working on a new command structure for NATO. We also, as I said, on the new relationships front, have worked hard to transform the relationship with Russia. In May of this year, we held the first meeting, it was at the summit level in Italy, of what we call the NATO-Russia Council. Now, this is not some kind of backdoor membership for NATO and Russia, for Russia and NATO, but it's an effort to find a way that Russia and NATO can work together, can build a new relationship, can develop patterns of cooperation. And we think that the best way to do this is by focusing on some very specific kinds of projects where we'll learn to work with one another and learn more about each other. We've just completed a couple of weeks ago what we call a civil emergency preparedness exercise in the Russian town of Noginsk. And what happened in that exercise was NATO and Russia worked together to go through what would happen if terrorists struck at a chemical plant and the consequences, how civilian authorities working with military authorities would deal with the consequences of that. It went on for 2 days, participants from more than 30 countries. So this is the kind of thing we want to focus on as we work with the Russians to build a new relationship with NATO. We're looking at areas like terrorism, joint terrorist threat assessments. We're looking at areas like missile defense and how we can defend not only ourselves but our allies and our friends from the threat of missiles from countries potentially like North Korea or Iraq. So this item on the agenda has also advanced very far, and we think there's more work that can be done, and we hope to advance this agenda at Prague as well. The other item, which I've saved for last, is that of enlargement. And on enlargement as well, we have been working very hard since last fall. The work, of course, has gone on since before last fall. And it goes back, in fact, to the Washington Summit of NATO, which took place in May of 1999. It was at that summit that NATO invited Hungary, the Czech Republic, and Poland to join the alliance. It brought them into the alliance. They were invited in Madrid. But at that summit as well, NATO concluded that there had to be a program to help countries prepare themselves for membership. That becoming a member of NATO was not an easy job, and the Poles, the Czechs, and the Hungarians did not find it easy to prepare themselves. So the NATO leaders, in a very wise act, I think, came up with something called the Membership Action Program. And this was an effort to try to encourage the countries themselves, and there were 9 countries that were brought into the Membership Action Plan. There were the 3 Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. There were Slovakia and Slovenia. There were Albania and Macedonia, and then Romania and Bulgaria. So those 9 countries voluntarily joined the Membership Action Plan. And the idea was that NATO wouldn't tell them what to do. We would say it's important that you undertake reforms in key areas to get yourself ready if you want to be a member of the alliance. And then they went off and drew up annual national plans. They would come back to NATO every year. We would discuss those plans. So these countries have been working very hard since 1999 to prepare themselves for membership. And we have also been working with them to judge their qualifications, to assess them, to give them guidance and advice. This has really been a very intensive process. This year alone, in February, with an interagency delegation, I visited all 9 countries. We had meetings with all the presidents, most of the prime ministers, foreign ministers, defense ministers of these countries, to go over with them their programs, to look at their reforms. And what we said to them is, if you want to be a member of NATO, there's no magic criteria. There's no boxes you can check. But there are 2 broad questions that you have to answer. For us, the first question is, can you convince us that you're going to be a democracy as far into the future as anybody can foresee? Because NATO countries are fundamentally democracies, and that is essential for the alliance. The second question that they had to be able to answer was, are you going to be a producer of security or just a consumer of security? Every country in NATO, no matter how small, has got to contribute to the security of the alliance. There's no free ride. NATO is a military alliance. So we told these countries aspiring to be members of NATO that they had to be contributing in proportion to their means, in proportion to their populations, but they had to contribute to the security of the alliance. So as I say, we have worked with them very closely to try to help them answer these questions, to tell them the problems we saw, and to push them on their reforms. As I say, we had this trip in February to all the countries. We had Deputy Secretary Armitage visit Bucharest in the spring, again with the same message. where he met with many of the leaders of the candidate countries. We had a midterm review, so to speak, in Washington this summer, where we had, again, an intensive review of the efforts of all these countries to carry out political, economic, military reforms. We also met with these leaders in Riga, Latvia, at a summit meeting of candidate countries that took place in July. And 2 weeks ago, we went back to all these countries to do the same trip we did in February. And again, we met with all the prime ministers, all the defense ministers, all the foreign ministers, I think except for two, and all the prime ministers except for two. I myself, with our ambassador to NATO, Nick Burns, in counting up the meetings we've had since February, we've had 80 meetings with presidents, prime ministers, foreign ministers, defense ministers, to go over their qualifications, to urge them to carry out reforms. So we've done this very intensively. Let me just say a word about what we saw on this trip in October and what some of our conclusions were. The first conclusion, which might be obvious, was that all these countries are using the NATO process, their desire to become members of NATO, to drive political and economic reforms. This objective of becoming members of NATO has been very important for them. It has encouraged them to do very difficult things that they want to do but might not have been able to do otherwise. Another thing we noticed and observed is all these countries, the 9 countries I talked about, are trying to act as de facto allies. They're not in the alliance yet, but they seem to have an understanding of what it is to be in the alliance and a willingness to contribute. And I'll mention just a few contributions. The Romanians have a mechanized battalion that they've sent to Afghanistan. And they got that battalion to Afghanistan on their own aircraft, which, if you recall what I said about mobility, is an indication of how an aspirant country is taking this process seriously. The Lithuanians have just approved sending 40 special forces personnel to Afghanistan. Again, a small country. You might say to yourself, well, what can they do? But they are trying to contribute. The Slovaks, who have a very good engineering unit, and I mentioned the specialization path for some NATO members. The Slovaks have a good engineering unit, and they're using that unit in Afghanistan. The Bulgarians, who allowed us to use airfields in Bulgaria when we were trying to fuel our tankers that were fueling our fighters that were on their way to Afghanistan. So there's a fact sheet in the folder that's on the table out there that lists things that other countries are doing. And it is quite important to see the contributions they're all making in Afghanistan and also in Kosovo and Bosnia, where, as I say, NATO has 40,000 troops. Another thing that we noticed on this last trip is that all the countries understand that NATO is a community of democracies, that values issues are important to us, that it's not just how many troops you can put in the field. It's, are you treating minority groups in your countries fairly? Are you dealing with issues of the past? And many of these countries have very complicated pasts, dealing with the Holocaust and property restitution. Are they taking these issues seriously? Are they dealing with problems of corruption? We came away again with the sense that all these countries are committed to dealing with this set of problems. Now, they all face challenges, and the challenges are things like corruption. This is, I think, the #1 problem for all the 9 countries, maybe one exception or 2 exceptions. Corruption is the thing that can undermine their democracies, has a very corrosive effect on trust, which is at the heart of a democracy. It is a problem for economic reform. If businesses can't rely on honest officials to deal with them, to do their licensing and other things, then it has a negative impact on the economy if it's based on bribes in the black market. So this is another problem area that results from corruption. And finally, on corruption, if corruption is rampant in the system, we worry about NATO's secrets. If officials are corrupt, we worry that they may sell those secrets to people we wouldn't want to have those secrets. So again, corruption is really a critical problem. Economic reform remains a major challenge. I was very struck in our meeting with the Romanian Prime Minister Anastasi, when he said that the per capita, he said the standard of living was the way he put it, in Romania has still not reached the level it was in 1989, that the process of transforming Romania from a centralized, very heavily centralized communist state to a market economy has been very disruptive. So the standard of living of the populations is a critical thing. If people don't live better, they're not going to support investment in defense. And so continued economic reform is a critical factor for all these countries. Defense reform is critical as well. It varies from country to country. You have countries like Bulgaria and Romania that inherited large armies from the Warsaw Pact days. We don't need those armies. We don't need Bulgarian tanks. The Bulgarians have got a submarine. We've been trying to tell them for a long time, get rid of that submarine. It's not going to help us. We don't need that submarine in NATO. We got much better submarines. Concentrate on something else. So they have work to do there. And they are trying. The other thing in Bulgaria and Romania is they have very high, their structure of their officer corps is padded with a lot of colonels and generals. The Bulgarians, this year alone, gotten rid of 9 generals and 34 colonels. That's the kind of thing they need to do. We don't need so many officers. We need better enlisted men for a modern fighting force. The countries in the Baltics have a different problem. When the Soviet Union collapsed, they were left with no militaries. So they're building their militaries from scratch. They're doing a good job, but they still need to continue this process of military reform. So these are some of the key areas that we're working on with all the countries where there's still challenges. What will the process be from this point forward? Well, we have less than a month to go before Prague. In the next week, the President's key advisors, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, National Security Advisor, other key members of his Foreign Affairs group will come together to come to a conclusion about their recommendations. They will present that set of recommendations to the President, and I would expect the President to make a decision sometime in early December. He will be, as part of this process, also consulting with Congress, because the Senate has to approve any new members we take into NATO, because it's an amendment to the treaty, the North Atlantic Treaty. So we have to have support in the Senate. And I would mention there that we are very pleased that Senator Mikulski and Senator Sarbanes have been such strong supporters of NATO enlargement. That is a support we very much welcome. So the President will consult with Congress, and then he will make his decision. Then he's got to talk to his partners in NATO. This is a consensus process. Everybody has to agree on the number of countries and those specific countries to be invited. Then what we expect will happen is that after he's talked to some of these leaders, we think there will be a consensus. We think there will be a consensus for a large enlargement. Now, I'm not going to give numbers tonight, but I will confidently say it will be a large enlargement. But the decision itself will only come at Prague. It will come on the first day of the summit, when the leaders meet together at 19, and they will formally issue the invitations to the new members. Now, I started out saying that at least I'm excited about all this, and if I may just take the liberty of a personal anecdote or two, which perhaps will explain to you why I think this is such a wonderful development to see these countries on the verge of being invited into NATO. I've been in the Foreign Service almost 30 years, and naturally there are events that stick out in that period of time. One of them was the first trip I made to Bucharest in 1979. And you cannot imagine a much more depressing place than Romania in 1979. It was the days of President Ceausescu. It was a brutal, awful dictatorship. You could not walk the streets without feeling that sense of hopelessness that existed there. About 10 years later, a little over 10 years later, in 1991, another example that sticks in my memory, I went to the Baltic States. They were still under Soviet domination then. I visited Riga and Tallinn and Vilnius. And it was a time of great tension with Moscow. There were Soviet tanks around the television towers in Vilnius. There were people who were shot in the street in Riga. All the parliaments, the assemblies of the 3 Baltic states had barricaded themselves in their buildings because they were afraid of the Soviets and what they might do. And again, I had this sense of kind of hopelessness and that the future was going to be very bleak. And here we are, not all that long ago, And instead of that bleak future that I saw in 1979 and that future that I saw again in 1991, history has proved us wrong. The people of these countries have proved us wrong. They've worked hard to prepare themselves to become part of Western institutions. And for me, as I say, that is a very exciting thing to be part of. So again, I thank you very much for your attention. I hope I've encouraged your interest in this set of issues, and I'd be happy to hear your comments or take your questions.
If mission can be out of area, why can't membership be out of area?
I will have to deal with the first part of your question by saying that we have been very careful in how we've described what NATO is doing. We think the mission has stayed the same. The mission has always been to defend the members of the alliance against external attack. So as we describe the change, it's the threats that have changed, the threats that are now from out of area. The mission is still the same fundamental mission of protecting the members of the alliance. Having said that, NATO treaty does, by geographic definition, limit itself to the North Atlantic area and the European theater. NATO does cooperate with other countries. The United States does cooperate bilaterally with Australia, New Zealand, other countries that have forces, Japan. I think at this stage of the process, it would seem to me just a little too ambitious to move to that phase. I think Europe's focus is going to remain the focus for NATO in the foreseeable future.
If you're going to have rapid response militarily, do you also have a rapid political response?
That will be a critical part of this. I mean, you obviously will need the approval of the North Atlantic Council, and that's NATO's decision-making body, to send this NATO response force when it's up and running. I mean, at this point, it's not up and running. We were hoping its first operational capability might be as early as the end of next year, but more likely a little longer. But you would need the approval of the North Atlantic Council, and that does require consensus of all members. Now, there's been a lot of questioning about whether the alliance can act and whether is it too unwieldy to have 19 countries and maybe 24, 25, 26 countries in the future decide to take an action like military action. I think if you look at the NATO's most recent history, there's a lot of mythology about what happened in Kosovo. And there's some mythology you read among commentators in the press that it was very difficult to carry out the air campaign in Kosovo because it was war by committee. But I think there's a bit of exaggeration there. One of the most interesting books that you can read, and I recommend it to you on Kosovo, is General Clark, Wesley Clark, who was the NATO commander during those days. And he wrote a book about the war in Kosovo. And he said he had far more trouble getting Washington to agree with what he wanted to do than getting the other members of the alliance in Brussels to agree with what he wanted to do. So we have been able, I think, to manage that process of consensus. And I think the allies that we'll be bringing in this next round, this is one of the other things that struck me during my trip. These are countries that are very pro-American and pro-Atlanticist. They have a strong positive feeling toward the United States. Many of them, like Romania, lived, like the Baltic States, lived under repressive regimes for 40 or 50 years. And they believe the United States, the steadfastness of the United States was critical to bringing about their freedom. And I think these countries are going to be loyal allies. I think they're going to be very close partners in NATO. And I suspect they will probably turn out to be even better partners than some of our current allies. I say that not criticizing our current allies, but I think these countries will be quite pro-American, quite Atlanticist in their outlook. And I would hope that this will not complicate the process of getting the consensus for NATO to use force.
The question is, what do you think will be the NATO Council's response if indeed the President of the United States urges a war on Iraq?
Yeah. We are working very hard in the United Nations to get the support of as many countries as we can, not just our NATO partners, but Russia, China, other countries in the Security Council. I believe that process will be a success. I believe that as we make our case in the Security Council, other countries will join with us. I do not expect, if their military action happens, and I'm not here to predict that there will be military action. War is not inevitable, as the President has said. But I believe countries will stand with us. Some of our partners have already made very clear that they will be with us if it comes to the need to use force in Iraq. I don't think this will be NATO as NATO carrying out that kind of war, but I think you will see quite a number of NATO countries who will want to help. I think that will be the instinctive reaction of our allies. Again, we're hoping through the work that's being done now in the Security Council that war is not inevitable, that we can build as much support for getting the inspectors back in under conditions where we can disarm Saddam and make sure he's disarmed. And that is the focus now.
Would you accept the position, or would you comment on the position, that NATO is being reduced to being a mere reservoir of allies and equipment to support an American foreign policy instead of, in essence, creating a NATO foreign policy?
I think NATO is a flexible tool. I think that, and there was the question of Afghanistan was raised, for example. If you look at the NATO allies, and again, I recommend the fact sheet that was in the folder, almost all of our allies are participating now in this current phase of what's going on in Afghanistan or in the recent past. And why are they doing this? They're not doing this necessarily because we had a decision in Brussels to do this, but they're doing this because they are partners of ours, allies of ours. They're also doing it because as NATO allies, we train together. We have common equipment. We have the capability of doing things together. So I would not discount the notion that NATO in some conflicts may be called upon to fight as an alliance at 26 to make the kind of decisions we've talked about that would require NAC approval and a consensus. But there may be other cases where NATO plays a different kind of role, that it is the habit of cooperation. It is the shared political values that lead us to approach it in a different way. And I don't necessarily think that's bad, that NATO can respond in differing ways depending on the nature of the conflict. So again, just because we fought Kosovo in a certain fashion, and it was a war where all the NATO decision-making process was engaged, and we met in Brussels and laid out the guidelines of the war. And Afghanistan is different. Other threats may also be different. But I don't think it's a bad thing that NATO countries can contribute in different ways than simply when the alliance is called upon at 19 to do something. As I say, the core of the habits of cooperation, the patterns of allies, those are going to be critical to enable us to do those things. So again, I think NATO can be a more flexible tool in the future, and I don't think that's a negative development.
Would you care to step on one of your colleagues' toes and comment upon the Korean circumstance?
I know my colleagues will not be happy for me to step on their toes, just as I would probably not be thrilled if they were answering questions on NATO and NATO enlargement. But I feel I should say one or two things. First of all, the agreement that we reached with the North Koreans, called the Framework Agreement, which goes back quite a ways into the mid-1990s, was an effort to try to get them to stop and shut down a nuclear program. There were not a lot of good options to do that. There was the possibility of military action, which was not a simple thing. None of our military thought it at the time in the early 1990s was a simple thing to do. There was a great danger of touching off a war on the Korean Peninsula. We began this negotiation with the North Koreans, which lasted quite some time, which was quite difficult, insisting that they open their nuclear plants up to inspection, that they allow us to come in and see what they got, that they dispose of the plutonium that they had. And in exchange for that, we were willing to help them with some of their energy problems. That was a bit of a bargain. I think in retrospect, I would still support that bargain, because the alternative was a very unstable North Korean regime developing nuclear weapons. And the question was, did we want to have to take military action against them? As it has turned out, the North Koreans have not lived up to their part of this bargain now. They have resumed their program, and we have caught them doing that. So the question is now how we handle this situation. This is not, I think every conflict is different. Every problem is different. Iraq is not exactly the same as North Korea. So the kind of threat that Saddam poses is different than, we have a different geographic setting, we have different international issues. We know more in some respects about what's going on in North Korea than we may about what's going on in Iraq. So we will try to deal with this situation. We will try diplomatically, because again, I don't think anyone wants to start throwing around military conflict in East Asia, a dangerous and volatile part of the world. So we will look hard at what they've done. We're not interested in rewarding them for bad behavior, but we're also not interested in having a war break out on the Korean Peninsula that could have potentially devastating consequences. That's where we diplomats have to try to earn our pay.
How do you deal with the problem of troops being placed under foreign leadership for the United States and for others as well?
We have always probably been more, if you will, protective in that regard, a little more stringent about how U.S. troops and who's under whose command they're deployed. We like to be sure that if you're going to put U.S. forces in harm's way, that it is a U.S. commander who's exercising that decision. But in some cases, there are other levels of command where U.S. forces do fall under, as part of a NATO command, a different commander. The commander in Kosovo, for example, was a French general up until just recently. Now the Italians have taken over the leadership of KFOR. So again, within the NATO context, we do try to work these things out. For other countries, in some respects, it's less of a problem. I think partly it's a question of confidence in the American military, but our allies, in many sets of circumstances, are quite willing to find themselves under American command, and indeed find that there are quite a few benefits of doing that because of the professionalism and the high standards of our military.
What are the advantages of having Turkey as a member of NATO, and what are the disadvantages?
Turkey has a tremendously important strategic position in Europe. If you look at the countries Turkey borders on, it includes countries like Syria, Iraq. This is really a critical kind of crossroads, if you will, of geopolitical forces. Turkey has been a loyal ally of the United States. If you look, for example, today, Turkish forces are leading the International Security Assistance Force in Afghanistan, which is the peacekeeping force in Kabul. Turkey has provided just critical basing rights for us to be able to carry out what we call Northern Watch over Iraq in order to protect the Kurdish population, in order to keep the air defenses of Iraq from being threatening to Allied aircraft. So Turkey has made many contributions to the alliance during the course of its membership. It's a very valued member of the alliance, and one whose contributions we value a great deal. Turkey is also the only Muslim member of NATO. I should say, country with a significant Muslim population. It is a secular state, but it has a significant Muslim population. That also brings a certain diversity to the alliance that we think is very important and very valuable. So, again, we think Turkey makes major significant contributions to the alliance. I will say what I think probably most in this audience know, that Turkey and Greece, for historical reasons, have had many difficult moments. And all of the issues and problems between Greece and Turkey, particularly over Cyprus, have not been resolved. We have encouraged both Greece and Turkey, and the Turkish Cypriots and the Greek Cypriots, to try to resolve those issues as soon as possible. That has been a long and difficult process, and a solution is long overdue. So again, I think Turkey makes an extremely valuable contribution to the alliance. There are some problems, and we work as closely as we can with the Turks to help resolve those problems.
Is preemption part of of NATO's thinking?
There's been a lot of attention to a new national security strategy that President Bush approved a couple of weeks ago, and one of the elements is the concept of prevention. It is one of the elements. It got more attention than anything else. I have a feeling a lot of the journalists and reporters who wrote stories on this only pulled up that part of it out and didn't bother to read the rest of the report. So the first thing I would say about preemption, it is one tool, one concept in what is a very comprehensive strategy. And nowhere does it say in there that if we see a problem, the first thing we're going to do is drop bombs on it. The strategy is much more complex than that. It involves lots of other tools, political, economic, diplomatic, and preemption is simply a possible tool. And I think it was actually Tony Blair who put it best when he was being questioned about this, and the British are great friends of ours, as you know. And he was appearing before the Trade Union Congress, and he got a question about, do you agree with the Americans about this prevention stuff? And it happened to be that it was September 10th of this year, so almost a year from the September 11 attack. And what he said to the group was, if we had known that this attack was being planned, and we had known that there were terrorists on the verge of carrying this attack out, of course we would have tried to do something to prevent it. No country would allow an attack to take place that it knew it could prevent, if it had the means to prevent. Now, when the circumstances are such that you know you can stop something, that is not always easy and clear. But to say that we should not take action if we know that an enemy is getting prepared to strike us, that's something I think that no leader would be prepared to accept. Let me take a different example than the two you mentioned, because it was one that occurred in some wargaming type exercises. That was an example of Iraq, which, as I said to this gentleman here, has a border with Turkey. And the hypothetical scenario here was the Iraqis moving forces up to the border, loading missiles with what we could tell from our intelligence was chemical and biological weapons. And that would have been a crucial decision. Would you let that happen? Would you let those forces be put into place? Would you wait until a rocket, a Scud, was launched into Turkey, where it would land and kill civilians, innocent civilians, because it had a warhead with chemical or biological weapons? Or would you say, they've gone far enough, we're going to have to take action? Now, it depends on the circumstances, whether we would do such thing unilaterally or we would ask our NATO allies to. But under circumstances, in my view, where a NATO ally is threatened with an imminent attack, and we can tell that there is a devastating attack that an enemy of ours is on the verge of taking, I would like to think that our allies would join us in taking whatever measures we could to keep that attack from happening. Again, it's a very high standard. You just don't go off lightly and do this. But there may well be cases where we can tell that an attack on the United States or an ally is in the works. And I don't think anybody would want to have their hands tied and have to wait until people were killed before they could take an action.
To what extent do other countries, other than the United States, exercise a leadership role? And could you elaborate on that?
It's an interesting question. I mean, I've sat in some of the North Atlantic Council meetings where you've got the 19 ambassadors, or in some cases the 19 foreign ministers, sitting around the table in Brussels. We've got one voice, they've all got one voice. And it counts the same. Now, we bring a certain other weight to the table, but in political terms, we're all equals when we sit around that table. So it's not just the case of the United States going in and saying to these countries, here's what we want to do, you sign on, you approve this, let's go. There's a lot of bargaining, there's a lot of negotiating. There are countries like France who have very strong views on what the alliance should do. There are countries like Germany as well that have very strong views on the alliance, the United Kingdom. But there are also smaller countries that play an important role as well. Portugal, I would just right off the top of my head mention the Portuguese contribution. So again, we're all equals around that table, and the views of all need to be taken into account. There's always a complex process of bargaining and negotiating that goes on within NATO councils.
Would you like to comment on the Caspian Sea and oil routes in Turkey?
Now I really will get myself in trouble with my colleagues. You've got Bill Burns coming, you can try that one on him as well. But basically, we think Turkey does play an important role there. The routing of the pipelines, and I'm far from the expert on this, so I'm treading into dangerous waters here. But we believe that bringing a lot of these natural energy resources out of the Caspian area has a lot of geostrategic importance. Are we going to run these pipelines through countries like Iran, who are hostile to the United States, and thereby enable the Iranians to make money from these pipelines, as well as potentially jeopardize the source of supply? We would like to see these pipelines run through dependable countries like Turkey. And indeed, we have worked very hard on something called the Baku-Ceyhan pipeline to bring these resources from the Caspian area through Turkey to the Mediterranean, precisely because we think it's important that these resources not somehow be held hostage to countries in the Gulf, in the Middle East, that are hostile to the United States.
The Russians apparently, and I don't know the story, have put a news blackout on all information about terrorism as a consequence of the seizing of hostages in a Moscow theater. Does that affect NATO in any way?
I have not seen the report of the passing of this particular law, so I'm a little hesitant to comment on that. This is obviously a very serious incident. As you said, I've seen numbers ranging 600 to 700 people, including a number of foreigners, who are being held hostage by terrorists from Chechnya in a theater in Moscow. We want to see this incident resolved peacefully. There has been a very bad history of the way some of these incidents involving Chechen terrorists have been resolved in the past. The President called President Putin this morning to offer his sympathy, to offer his support if there's something we can do. But we very much focused on trying to resolve this in a peaceful way. And that is, I think, all that I really feel I can say.
Would you give your view of what the Islamic countries' view is of us? And to what extent do you think that those countries or the Islamic world becomes, for some people, the enemy that the Soviet Union used to be?
Yeah. You had asked maybe a slightly different question, which was Islamic countries think of NATO. And there I can't say that I'm probably not an expert on the Islamic world, but there's very little that's come to my attention that when the Iraqis or the Iranians are mad at the rest of the world, they're mad at NATO. Typically, they're mad at the United States and they're mad at Israel. And the focus is not NATO and not even our European allies in some cases. It is still more the United States and, as I said, Israel. I guess the only thing I would say is that the President has tried to make clear very strongly since September 11 that we do not perceive the enemy as the Islamic world. This is not a religious war. We have close friends and allies who are Islamic countries, but a certain kind of Islamic fundamentalism that supports terrorism is an enemy that has shown it is prepared to strike the United States, and we will have to be prepared to respond accordingly. So we're not going around the world looking for enemies here. We want Islamic countries, we want the Islamic world to be friends with the United States. We have very good friends in the Islamic world, and we want to maintain and build those relationships. We're not looking at kind of making an enemy of any country, but when countries develop weapons of mass destruction, when they threaten their neighbors, it doesn't matter whether they're Islamic countries or secular countries. And if you look at a country like Iraq, I mean, Saddam occasionally tries to dress himself up in Islam, but in fact, Iraq is a secular country. In any case, it is the threats that these countries pose or their leaderships pose, not the fact that they're Islamic, that is a matter of concern to us.
Unfortunately, it's 10 after 7. We have to end our questions. I know a lot of you still have questions, and it would be enjoyable to continue. However, let me simply thank you for a wonderfully complete and full presentation.
Thank you very much.